Yep. Okay, so let me just do a little intro if we got in the audience. This is Carl Haid, Office of the Executive Secretary for the Virginia Supreme Court. Do I have that correct?
Yes, sir.
Great. Carl, go ahead.
All right. Thank you for having me here this morning. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Just covering some of the major items that were included in the introduced budget for the judiciary, as well as a quick update on where we are with the COVID impact on the court system. First of all, I'd like to thank you. A couple years ago, you allocated money for funding for 120 clerk positions, and that came in extremely helpful during this COVID 2 years, because obviously a lot of clerks were out sick with COVID and quarantined and various things like that. So it enabled us to help keep the doors open. At that time, when you allocated those positions, we were close to 300 positions short in our district courts. We're now short about 176 positions, and this item that was included in the budget would fund up to another 120 positions. There's also language that would enable us to possibly do something in terms of salary compensation, combination of positions and compensation. So there's $7.8 million for another, what we call phase 2, getting us closer to being fully staffed. As I mentioned earlier, COVID really has put pressure on our staff between quarantining and 95% of our district court clerks are female. So we were impacted by virtual schooling, people having to make decisions to stay home and take care of their elderly parents and things like that. So we did lose some people, and fortunately we're able to rehire and keep things going. So this funding is very much needed to staff our courts. The next item is dealing with some retention issues that we're experiencing in the magistrate area. It gets increasingly difficult to recruit and retain magistrates. We spend a lot of money on training. They go through a four-week training program, certification school. And at the end of that, they must pass a pretty difficult exam. And then they also have to do some on-the-job training as well as continuing education. We're experiencing in many of our districts turnover rates in excess of 30%. In a recent 24-month period, we lost 146 out of 400 magistrates. And yes,
I'm just curious, that's 40% of your magistrates, it looks like.
Yes.
Is that retirement, or they got better jobs, or what happened?
Just recently, as an example, we lost 6 to 8 to VEC. They hired them as hearing officers.
Ah, okay.
We were paying 40-some thousand. They went to VEC for 60,000.
Oh, yeah.
It helped me with magistrate, because I know magistrates, but is that a full-time position, or?
Yes, sir, full-time position. But obviously they work 24 hours a day, so there's shifts. They're magistrates during the day, at night, weekends, holidays.
And they're not required to be lawyers?
They're not. We have a mix of non-lawyers, and some are lawyers. The chief magistrate is required to be a lawyer.
And the average salary is $40,000?
Around $44,000 right now.
That's just not going to make it.
No, it's not. It's really making it difficult for us to keep the system functioning. And you can see prior to this recent time, our median years of experience for a magistrate was 8 years.
Right.
We're down to 4 years now with this turnover rate. Like, as I mentioned earlier, Chesterfield, in just the course of a couple weeks, lost 6 magistrates to VC. And they got over $10,000, about $15,000 raises, and now they get to work 9 to 5, no weekends, no nights, no holidays. So it's kind of a no-brainer for them to make that jump. So this money would help us get their starting salaries up into the 50s, which would make us more competitive. So that's
okay. All right.
That's what we're shooting for there. The next item that was included, probably a decade ago, we were seeing, morning, Senator.
How are you?
Good
Good.
morning, Joe.
We were seeing,
Carl with Supreme Court.
yes. We were seeing a tremendous growth in the criminal fund expenditures in the area of foreign language interpreters, and the General Assembly decided to go along with a proposal we had, which was to start hiring staff interpreters in some of the courts with the highest volume of interpreter needs.
Right.
And we found that by hiring a person to be there full-time, it was cheaper than what we were paying for contract interpreters. So that program has grown over the years. It's held down expenditures in the criminal fund, and $1 million was included in this budget to hire 10 more of those positions. We're trying something new with a few of them. We're increasingly getting ADA complaints when it comes to interpreter services for people that are deaf or hard of hearing. And we have to get those folks from VDDHH, Virginia Department of Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And increasingly, they're having a hard time accommodating our needs around the state. So we would like to actually try and hire one or two of these folks so that we could be able to get them where they're needed in the court system.
All right, help me. In criminal, you have a right to an interpreter. If I have a civil case, I got to pay for an interpreter out of my own pocket.
That's correct. This is the criminal
This
cases.
is all criminal.
Yes, sir. All criminal. And we've placed these, we get a couple of benefits out of having a staff interpreter. One, they're not only there for interpreter services, but they can help out in these courts at the counter when somebody comes up and has difficulty communicating. We also hire certified interpreters, so we have a higher level of quality by doing that. And the program's been very successful to date, and we put them into these, like Northern Virginia and other areas where we see a high volume of non-English speaking litigants. So this would provide 10 more of those positions. I would also mention that one of the, I guess, benefits of COVID, if you want to call it that, is there was a reduction in expenditures in the criminal fund. So this budget includes a $33 million reversion from the criminal fund to the general fund.
Okay.
And just as an aside to mention, I know the state received a lot of ARPA funding, and the governor's targeted some of that money for things as well as the money committees. The judiciary did not receive any of that ARPA funding. So these
You did not.
we did not receive any of that.
Did you want it?
We wanted it, but the feds give it to the executive branch, and you have to, as a judicial branch, you have to try and get it from the executive branch, and we've not been successful in getting any of that funding. So, but I'm thinking part of the reason we got these things included in the budget was we didn't get ARPA funding, but we got this funding.
Okay, all right.
Right, makes sense.
Okay.
On the COVID impact, as I mentioned earlier, the courts and the magistrate offices remained open throughout the pandemic to the extent that we could. There were times where some of our smaller courts with just 2 or 3 clerks, the entire court had to shut down for a few days for cleaning and for quarantining, but for the most part, we were able to stay open. What we've seen happen over this past year is our general district and juvenile domestic relation courts have done a really good job of clearing their backlogs. They kept things going fairly well during the first year. COVID was a little tougher than the second, but we've seen a significant decrease in their backlogs. The circuit courts are another matter. They've had challenges in the jury trial area. And that's where we're working on the most with the circuit courts, is trying to get that caught up. Criminal cases are taking priority in some of these courts for speedy trial reasons, and we need to get that cleared up so we can get these civil trials moving again. We've developed reports. I think I reported on that last year to you, that we developed a series of reports that we made available to the clerks to help them identify the cases that were at a certain age or a certain type, so they could triage their dockets when things were starting to get a little bit more normal. And those reports have been very helpful to the judges and the clerks.
Well, what's your caseload in terms of resolving cases? Are you back where you were in 2019, or are you still a little bit behind? I'm looking at, is just these numbers are...
Yeah, on the next slide, I'm sorry, I wasn't advancing
That's all right.
the thing, but the next slide will show you where we are on pending caseload. And you'll see that in the circuit area, pretty much what I just mentioned, that the criminal pending caseload has gone down. The civil has gone up slightly, and that's a result of those jury trial tensions between.
You probably have fewer indictments also.
We're seeing it's starting to tick back up.
Okay.
In the filings, 2021, particularly in the district courts, with the exception of criminal for some reason in the general district courts, those filings are not back up to where they used to be, but they are in the traffic and the civil areas, getting back to normal levels. But you can see that progress was made in particularly in the district courts and the juvenile domestic relation courts, where they were able to clear 20-some thousand more cases in 2021 than they did in 2020, and the juvenile domestic similar percentage-wise. So in total in 2021, we resolved over 60,000 more cases than were handled in 2020 in terms of the pending caseload.
Okay, I mean, just looking at these numbers, and GDC, General District Court, you have 21% drop in criminal cases being
Pending, yeah.
pending,
Yes,
which
sir.
I assume 21%, you just had fewer charges.
It was a combination of both. It was
Okay.
fewer charges as well as trying to get back to normal in terms of hearing more and more cases. When COVID first hit, the judicial emergency order triaged the types of cases that courts could hear. It was really just emergency matters as we tried to figure out what was happening in those early months.
Yeah.
Then the judicial emergency orders changed to where, as long as the court was implementing the prescribed safety standards, they could hear more cases and different types of cases. And particularly in the district and the JNDR courts, they jumped on that, and that's why we're seeing the backlogs have really been sufficiently reduced in those courts. And again, the circuits are doing as well as they can. It's a little bit more challenge with the jury trials and trying to hold those safely with the jurors and the people that are in the courtroom. And there's also requirements that when we have those cases, if the public or the media wants to be there, we've got to provide us a video feed in some of these courthouses because we can't get all of them into the courtroom, but we've got to have a place where they can watch the proceeding. So that first slide shows you pending, and the next slide will show you actual dispositions. And again, you'll see that the change in cases resolved at the circuit level, 2021 versus 2020, they resolved 11,000 more civil cases than the prior year and 20,000 more criminal cases in the prior year, for a 12 and 14% increase in the number of cases that were disposed of. The general district level, again, not much of a change because they really kind of got things going in 2020 and got ahead of it. So a little bit of almost level, if you will, for civil and criminal. And the traffic was where they saw the biggest increase because they were able to move those cases along. And then our JNDR cases, again, we saw more and more cases disposed of in 2021 than we did in 2020. And of course, the juvenile cases are a whole different matter. They're not like general district. Most general district cases, it's one hearing and it's done. But the juvenile matters usually require several hearings before they can be resolved. So all in all, I think we're making good progress. Hopefully, these variants will continue to be milder and milder, and we can get back to normal because it's almost like staff out there. I feel like I'm having to be a counselor at times, PTSD or something. I mean, it's really taken a toll on them because, like many other agencies, they've been frontline responders in many ways. I mean, they've been there, they've been sick, and unfortunately, we have actually lost a few people to COVID in our court system. But they're doing a great job, and I'm very proud of them. And we'll continue to plug away at these backlogs, particularly in the circuit courts. And we're providing training and assistance where we're asked to try and get this behind us.
Okay. Any questions? Adam?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on the COVID, I appreciate all you did to try and get through this. But I had a question about the languages, and that when I came in, you were discussing some of that.
Language interpreters?
Yeah. Not so much about the interpreters, but when in some of the circuits that I represent, they've got unique language challenges. Like in Arlington, they have a lot of Mongolian speakers in the court system. And we talk sometimes when we interview judges about the availability of materials in different languages, and sometimes new candidates for judge say they want to see this or that brochure printed in a different language. And I'm wondering, does the Supreme Court provide any kind of standard brochures on dealing with the court system for people who haven't been there before? And if they do they make those available in different languages so that instead of having Arlington printing in Spanish, but maybe there's some other locality further in Virginia that doesn't have a thing in Spanish, that they could just kind of download a template or a PDF and print it rather than translate their own brochure in each court, or do they need different pieces?
We do provide some general information in brochures, and to date primarily English and Spanish, and some of that's just a limitation of finances to get the other
Sure.
materials produced.
It might make sense, I don't know how complicated it would be to check with the circuits, if they've gone to the trouble to translate them into another language, that maybe you could then take that and make it available on your website if other court systems end up with a speaker of that language.
That's an excellent idea, and I'll check with the
Thank you.
circuit courts, particularly up in your area, because as you said, we see a wide variety of languages up there. We've actually started hiring, the last go-around, we hired staff interpreters. We hired some Korean and Vietnamese interpreters because we were seeing an uptick in that area as well.
Yes, exactly. You may see a lot of Korean population in Fairfax County, but then there could be another locality elsewhere in the state that has a smaller Korean population that would still enjoy having that brochure, able to print it on demand, or maybe a fewer copies for them.
Excellent suggestion. We'll look
Okay.
into that.
Other questions from the panel?
So in closing, if I may. since we
Okay,
talked
I'm going to have
about-
a couple questions.
Okay,
We're going to
sure.
let you get out of here that easy.
Oh, no, that's
Okay.
fine. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't get that ARPA funding, so what's
Okay.
in the budget would be extremely helpful for us if it remained there. So,
Okay. Now, let me give you, as a practitioner,
yes, sir.
and I've been sort of with it on the other end,
Mhm.
you know, when we had the court shut down in March, and then we started doing virtual trials. I think I actually did the first virtual trial, at least in Fairfax County, in May. I didn't like the virtual trials. It's not easy to cross-examine a witness, and you have an issue with other people being in the room that you can't see when you cross-examine a witness. So I felt like it was a poor substitute. Now, these were civil trials, so you don't have all the same, you know, Sixth Amendment issues with confrontation. But here's my real question, and that is, what are we doing to guarantee litigants that if they want to appear in court, face-to-face, that they have that opportunity?
Well, we suggest that to the judges. You know, as you know, the circuit court clerks are a little bit different because they're elected officials, so sometimes they're not.
I'm not talking about clerks, I'm talking about courtrooms.
Well, sometimes and when this first started, sometimes the clerks were part of that decision-making, if you will. But our advice to the judges and the clerks has been that the virtual stuff should be agreed to by the litigants. Now, if Fairfax is not doing that, I can certainly
I
reach
think
out
they're
to
just doing it for motions at this point.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any trials still going on virtually.
And we did recommend, particularly during the height of COVID, that those types of things would be most conducive to virtual hearings, things that are quick and, quick motion or whatever, or an arraignment hearing or something like that, but not the trial itself. We have not really advocated that at all.
Okay, well, the Supreme Court was handing down orders at different points.
Right.
So,
But the orders were not suggesting that they do trials virtually, but
okay.
we'll certainly continue to get
All
that
right,
word
well, let me
out.
get to the next point, which is the Supreme Court itself has been having virtual hearings for 2 years.
Yes.
And we need to move back to where we were.
My
And what's the
understanding
plan
that they're
on
about ready to do that. They were scheduled to do that in January, and then Chief Justice Lemons rather quickly announced his retirement, which meant they had to cover that January docket with seniors. And one of our senior justices is in his 90s, the other one's in his 80s. There was some just concern at that point that they were going to have to sit on a lot more cases, it being the first one back, so they quickly pivoted to virtual. But it's my understanding the next session would be in person. That's the
Okay.
plan right now.
And I'll be blunt, I have language I'd like to put in the budget saying if either party requests a live hearing before a Supreme Court panel, and I've got multiple coming up, they have a right to do it live.
Okay.
Because I think just as circuit court judges have to be there,
Yeah.
it's, at the end of the day, it's always about the customer.
And as I said, my understanding is they had planned that, but with the announcement from Chief Justice Lemons, they had to bring in all the seniors to sit on a lot more cases than they normally would. So,
Lemon's younger than the other two.
I was gonna say, he's still sitting though, isn't he?
no, he's retired effective today.
After that,
And-
with that redistricting, he bailed.
He has to sit off.
So when I get my next panel, he's not gonna be up on the bench.
Correct. He has to sit off for 13.
Gone.
Go.
So I can say whatever I want.
That's right.
Okay, no, listen, I'm a big fan of Don Lemons and whether or not he's up there, but again, let me just reiterate the main
Absolutely.
point, which is it's about the litigants and it's about justice. And it's frustrating when you're talking to a panel and it's like video screens popping up and, this has been 2 years, guys.
Yep.
So, come on.
Yes. Justice Lemons is eligible to come back as a senior, but with the
How
affordable.
long?
Yes, it's
Senior
set off for
justice.
13 weeks before you
13
can
weeks,
come back,
okay.
yeah. So back, I think it's May 4th, he's eligible to come back.
Who are your seniors that are sitting right now?
Senior Justice Millette.
Well, he's not 90 years old.
No, he's not. Kuntz is in his 80s, and then Russell's in his 90s. Charlie Russell.
Okay.
Age is only a number.
And Leroy's like in the 60s. Okay.
Yes, he's the youngest of
He's the
them.
youngest. Okay.
And
Any,
then, and then Justice Mims is retiring in May, I believe it is. So he and
he's pretty young. He could still
He's-
beat me in the
yes.
5K at the VTLA.
and he's an
Okay.
avid cyclist as well.
It's kind
But
of
he and Lemons will both be eligible to become seniors.
All right. Well, I appreciate any questions from the panel while we got Carl here. And Carl, thank you. This
Yeah.
is really excellent. And I please go ahead.
We're originally we started out down 300, and then you helped us with that. So now we're down 176.
And what's our retention for GDC? I mean, now I know that was an issue 2 years ago, and we put that extra filing fee.
It varies by locality. Obviously, in some areas, like in Fairfax, where it's easier to move from place to place,
Right.
retention's more of a challenge than some of our rural areas. But we've been working over the years with you and internally to try and increase starting salaries, and that's definitely helping. But it's not where it probably should be. Just like with the magistrates, some of our better clerks get hired away down the hall to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office or a public defender's office.
I'm going to get poached by local law firms.
Yes, I've had that conversation with Senator McDougal.
Yeah.
He's taken a few of our clerks as well.
Oh, my
But
God.
I took one in Fairfax. Yeah.
so that's another issue that we'll continue to try and work on. That's compensation for the clerks.
Okay.
So,
Any
I
other
think-
questions from the panel? Carl, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. And
It's been great.
Yeah, good
as
stuff.
always, if there's any information that you need or would like, just get in touch with my office. I'm happy to help you out. Y'all have a great day.
Okay, all right.
Too.
We're not proxying, there's no votes.
There's no votes.
Okay.
Okay, the next up, we have, we're going to look at the rainy day fund and the revenue reserve fund. And that is, Adam, why don't you,
That's you the most
Just-
important.
oh,
you're the most important piece in this whole
Not,
thing.
not even remotely
Oh, yeah,
close.
you are.
why don't you, can you, I got to make sure that I don't have a hot mic over here when I talk to Jill.
Yeah, sorry, never mind.
That's okay. Can you tell us about the rainy day fund and the revenue reserve fund? And since we've got, I know, a large audience watching from home, can you give a little bit of background constitutionally about what they are and what some of the parameters are?
Yes, sir, that's the
Thank you.
plan. So, okay, again, I'm going to go over some of the constitutional and statutory provisions related to the Revenue Stabilization Fund or Rainy Day Fund, as it's commonly referred to, and the Revenue Reserve Fund, as well as the required and proposed deposits contained in the introduced budget and the current and projected combined fund balance between the two. So beginning on slide 2, so under Article 10, Section 8 of the Constitution of Virginia, a mandatory deposit shall be made if the combined growth in individual and corporate income taxes and sales taxes exceeds the prior 6-year average. So if that occurs, the amount of the deposit is required to equal 1/2 of the growth above the 6-year average. And there are some exclusions that apply that I'll speak to later about what can be excluded when you're doing that calculation for the required deposit. So the actual deposit in the fund to the fund occurs in the second fiscal year following the year of the surplus. So that's why we have one in 23. There was a surplus in FY21. Constitution also provides that additional appropriations of the fund may be made so long as the total fund balance doesn't exceed the limitation. And I'll also speak to that too in just a moment. So on slide 3, looking at the mandatory deposits to the rainy day fund. So there are also some statutory requirements related to the rainy day fund, one of which relates to additional deposits when certain revenue growth thresholds are met. So under the code, an additional deposit may be required if the combined growth in individual and corporate income taxes and sales taxes is at least 8% and at least 1.5 times the prior 6-year average growth rate. So that would be the super deposit, if you all had heard about that, right? Above the constitutional, there's an additional amount that's statutory that would suggest that you need to put an additional amount if these thresholds are also met.
Since it's statutory, it gets overruled by whatever the budget.
Exactly, right. So that's considered, so that's a good point. On the third bullet on that slide, you can see the generally assembly. Exactly, right. It's required that it shall be included
Right.
in the budget for consideration, but it doesn't really have any, right. Yeah, exactly, right. So that's it. So, and you can see, so I just spoke to the governor, must include the additional deposit if it's at least equal to 1/4 the growth above the 6-year average, but only if the revised revenue forecast projects general fund revenue growth of at least 5%. So that's the trigger that wasn't met to necessitate that. But I'll get to it in a couple of slides, that funding amount is actually reflected in the budget.
Let me ask you a question. We say the growth is 5%, but 5% can be illusory. Is that 5% inflation adjusted, or is that just 5% raw growth?
It's the official forecast. It's what the biennial budget is predicated on.
Okay, that
right?
didn't answer my question. Is it inflation adjusted, or is it just raw dollars?
It would be, I assume that inflation and other factors would be considered when Jabe and Gaker meet and develop the consensus, during the consensus revenue forecasting process. I would assume that inflation is one of the considerations in that process.
Okay, so when we're projecting forward the budget, the top lines of the budget, we take into account inflation. Now, let's say inflation is higher than what we took into account, then the raw dollars on paper would be more, but the actual value of that money would be less.
Sure.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
But we're
Yeah.
still locked into these rules. I'm not saying they're bad, I'm just saying that's a fact.
There are revenue reforecasting that occurs. There are statutory
Why
provisions.
can't you just say, yes, chap, you're correct?
Yes, sir.
That's good.
Absolutely.
All right, next question.
100%
Wait,
correct.
but there is no downside to it, though.
I'm just saying that-
in there,
No,
in,
is that also correct?
Yeah, well, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that if we have inflation, and then the numbers come in higher, but they don't necessarily mean more because we got to pay our employees more.
sure. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just saying.
yes.
Just
that-
saying.
That is correct.
Right, thank
Moving
you.
on.
That's all I'm
Moving
saying.
on.
Okay.
100%.
All right.
All right, so let's go to the next slide here. So again, I'd spoken a moment ago about some of the limitations to the revenues that are used as basis for the calculation. So that would, to determine whether or not the RDF deposit needs to be made. So the growth in income taxes and sales and use taxes that is a result of either an increase in the income or sales tax rates or the repeal of exemptions therefrom may be excluded from the calculation. So if you'd increase, that's the product of increasing tax rates, or you had some exemptions that expired and that caused an increase in your revenues, that could be excluded from the requirement to make a deposit.
Okay.
And that exclusion applies for up to 6 years from the effective date of the change. All right, now to quickly cover withdrawals from the fund, still on rainy day fund. So a withdrawal is allowed when a revised revenue forecast shows a shortfall of at least 2% of the previous year's actual collections for individual and corporate income tax and sales tax. So if that happens, the maximum amount of the withdrawal is the lesser of 1/2 of the budget shortfall or half of the fund's balance. And slide 6. So now we're in deposits into the statutory revenue reserve fund, and that was enacted in 2018, if you recall. So this happens whenever there is a general fund surplus, but it doesn't meet the constitutional threshold for a mandatory rainy day fund deposit. In this instance, the comptroller must commit in their year-end report the surplus for deposit to the revenue reserve. And the amount of this commitment is equal to the lesser of the amount of the general fund revenues in excess of the official forecast less any deposit to the Water Quality Improvement Fund, or 1% of general fund revenues collected during the year in question. And then again, just like other statutory provisions, this is going to be considered alongside all other factors in the budget. All right, so looking at withdrawals from the Revenue Reserve Fund. So the General Assembly may appropriate a transfer from the fund when a revised revenue forecast shows a shortfall that is 2% or less. So you can see there the difference being from the Revenue Stabilization Fund or Rainy Day Fund, that's at least 2%, right? So that's kind of catching that difference there. So 2% or less of the previous year's total general fund resources collected. So the withdrawal is limited to half of the funds existing balance, and the withdrawals are generally meant to stabilize revenues when a withdrawal, again, from the rainy day fund can't occur. And also, when the General Assembly is not in session, the code provides that after review of May general fund revenue collections and certification that actions to curtail spending will not be sufficient to avoid a cash deficit, the governor may withdraw amounts in the fund to avoid a deficit. All right, on slide 8, so now speaking to kind of the maximum fund balance, and there's just a couple of slides too, so I know this is kind of tedious stuff. So constitutionally, the rainy day fund can't exceed 15%. So there's a constitutional provision that's specific to the revenue stabilization fund, and then there's another statutory that speaks to the combined balances of both funds. So the rainy day fund can't exceed 15% of the prior 3-year average annual tax revenues from individual and corporate income taxes and sales taxes. And then there's also that similar statutory provision that limits the combined balance of both funds to 15% of the prior 3-year average of those revenue sources. As of June 30th, 2021, the maximum combined fund balance is $2.9 billion. So now going over what is included in SB 29 and SB 30.
And that, when you said the combined fund, you're
Senator
talking about
Lucas.
the revenue, I'm sorry. Mr.
No,
Chairman.
please, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, you're talking about the revenue reserve fund and the rainy day.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yep. So in the introduced budget, so the amended budget for FY22 and then 23 and 24 and SB 30, there's a voluntary deposit, the revenue reserve fund of $563.9 million. So this amount matches what would have been required as that statutory super deposit to the rainy day fund had that 5% revenue growth forecast trigger happened. There's also existing budget language that allows for these amounts to be transferred to the rainy day fund to meet any constitutionally required deposit based on revenue growth in either year of the biennium. So, for example, if FY22 resulted in year-end revenues that necessitated a deposit in FY24, that amount can be transferred to offset that need. So it's kind of putting in hold, and then there are also the other provisions that allow for you to draw down if there's a cash deficit and so forth. SB 30 includes $1.1 billion, which reflects the constitutional deposit to the rainy day fund in FY23. So the introduced budget also includes language notwithstanding the current statutory cap of the 15% combined balances, given that the total combined balance may exceed this based on the FY23 balance with these additional deposits that are included in the budget in relation to the prior 3-year average of individual and corporate income and sales taxes.
Okay, let's get to the numbers here, because I'm on slide 10.
Here we go. Yep.
Okay, so if I look at slide 10, FY23 begins, what, July 1, 2022?
That's correct. Yep.
So at that point, on the track we're on now, which, like I said, I think when you get your January non-withholding payments, you're going to be ahead of that. You're at $3.879 billion in your reserves. Now, about half of that is rainy day, and about half of that is the reserve fund on top of it. But at that point, you're either at or above 15%.
That would be, so it's
So
based.
yes, no, or explain.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. and
Now
then
explain.
Gotcha. So based on 2021-22 prior 3-year average, 20 and 21 are actual collections. 22 is essentially a projection, a budgeted projection. So based on that deposit relative to those, yes, it's above 15%.
Okay, now constitutionally, we can do that because the rainy day fund is below.
Correct.
Statutorily, there's, again, an advisory opinion. We should not do that, but we can ignore that and just continue to bank the money.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, any questions from the panel? Everybody understand that? Okay,
All right.
go ahead. Yes, sir.
That's, well, that really kind of does it. You can see 3.9. So, again, I had spoken to if there were a 24 deposit, for example, and there's funding in 22 that could be transferred to offset the cost of that 563.9 would move over and satisfy a portion of that. So that number 23 would come down. So it's kind of dynamic, right, depending on in which year you have to make a deposit. There's just a lot more flexibility with the revenue reserve fund to kind of meet those needs. So that 3.9 in FY '24, I think, just essentially reflects what the interest earnings on the fund balance in FY '23 would be. So that's not accounting for any other growth. It's just the projected growth plus interest earnings in '24. So, I mean, that's really it. So I can answer any other questions you might have, but that covers it.
The 3.9 billion, and this gets back to my inflation question, that's actual dollars. This is money sitting in accounts. This isn't just money on a ledger. Yes, no, then explain.
Yes, to a degree.
Okay.
Right, so some of it has been appropriated or been introduced, and some is sitting in an account. So less the amounts, it's my understanding that the amounts less what is currently proposed for appropriation. So whatever the existing balance is, the 1.1 that's in there plus the 563.9, you'd subtract that from the 3.879, and that would be the actual balance that's sitting there, previously adopted appropriations that are in the fund, that are actually in the fund, whereas the current things right now are proposed for appropriation.
Okay, but as of July 1, 2022, I guess what you're saying is that'll be future taxes paid into it.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, now that brings me to my next point. Like I said, I talked about inflation. Let's say inflation's at 6%. This money that we're holding, let's say it's $1.5 billion. Is it earning interest? Where is it?
Yes, sir. It's earning interest in an interest-bearing account, a treasury account.
So
I don't know
like less than
specifically.
1% then?
I don't want to say anything incorrect, so I'll just hold off.
Fair enough,
Yeah,
okay. I
yeah.
don't want to, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but
No, no,
that's
no,
a lot
that's-
of money to be sitting
I
around.
can speculate just based on how we do things generally. Like if
Okay.
if we demand deposit, like we're constantly pulling cash out, usually you're going to have no interest or very little interest. If this is just sitting out there for long periods of time, it's more likely that it's a higher interest-bearing account. But I don't know specifically what those numbers are. I
Any
do know it earns
questions
interest.
from the panel?
I don't have any yes or no.
Jill?
No. I don't have any yes or no questions.
That's a no answer.
But I'm intrigued by the $3.9 billion just sitting around.
Just sitting, yeah, because it's just, that's a lot of money, and obviously it's money we're holding, and we need to have a cash reserve. That's a no-brainer. By the same token, if it's our money, we want it to be earning some type of appreciation. I mean, it's
It
biblical.
is
You
earning
don't want-
interest. It
Okay.
is absolutely earning interest. Yeah.
I have to say, and I probably shouldn't, well, I'll just go ahead and say it. About 10 years ago, my wife's cousin, who's a businessman in Korea, called me and wanted to ask if I would talk to the director of VRS about investing money in something called Bitcoin. And I was like, nah, I don't think I'm going to do that. But, that would have been transformative, but anyways. Okay. All right, well, Adam, any other, so this is very good. I think for those folks listening at home, basically, as of July 1, 2022, we're going to be sitting on $3.9 billion, which, as Adam has pointed out, about half of it's real money, and then about half of it's projected over what we will collect in taxes. Did I summarize that correctly?
If the proposed appropriations are adopted, yes.
Okay. All right. So that, again, if we say do a tax cut or if we do an expanded spending, it's going to draw it down
Yes, significantly.
significantly.
I would imagine the revision, the 1.1 is the constitutional deposit, so that will
Well,
go.
that's in for good, and we can't touch that. That's constitutional.
563.9 is the number that would be subject to change.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. I think we're good. Thank you,
sir.
Adam.
Thank you.
Any other
Appreciate
questions?
it.
I got to
Oh,
respond to that. No, are you,
yes,
any
ma'am.
other questions? Yes
Any
or
other
no?
question?
No.
No. I have to tell you, I have witnesses for trial, and you'll ask them a question, and they'll never answer the question. They want to talk about themselves. I said, yes, no, then explain. Okay. All right. Do we have anything else we need to cover today?
Nope.
Okay. When are we going to hear from DHRM?
We can work on that. I'll have to check with the administration and see where we are with,
Finding out where our people are.
yeah,
Okay.
we'll work
All
on
right.
that.
Okay, gang. Appreciate everyone being here this morning.
You bet.
I think we're adjourned. Okay.